Hello, everyone, and welcome to the lecture on Unit 4 on Justice and Virtue. In the past lecture, we were talking more about like how to achieve a good, egoism, utilitarianism. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about how we could do the good in spite of the end that it may bring us, or even maybe the pleasure. So we'll take a look at two people, David Hume and Immanuel Kant, and I guess a third, John Rawls. So anyway, with David Hume, there's this is and ought. Like, just because there's the way that something is, like, I like to tell the truth and I think people should tell the truth, a statement like that, does that mean that we ought to do it? He says no. He said, really, he said, when we say something like, I think people should tell the truth, we're really just expressing a desire that we have. And you really can't derive an ought from simply the fact or what you consider the state of things and how they are. So telling the truth, really, when you make a statement like that, is nothing more than saying that I support that. All right, so it's something that I'm behind. So it appears then with Hume that it's nothing more than an expression of your desire. And since desires are subjective, right, because your desires and my desires might change, he says this really cannot be a basis for morality. It's just simply a factual statement of how we might feel, which is why there's an endorsement there of what's known as like a non-cognitive emotivism, right? So our emotions will derive the morality by which we follow. And if you are going to try to make the claim, at least this is according to Hume, if you're going to make the claim that the ought is derived from the is, just because this is the state of affairs, therefore we should abide by it, he'll call that the naturalistic fallacy, and it's often known to as Hume's fork, all right? Now, the issue that you may have with this might be similar to Immanuel Kant's. Immanuel Kant says, you know, like the desires and feelings, obviously they're subjective and they change from person to person. So how can we derive a morality simply from those, even if it's the majority, those people who simply approve or disapprove of something? So what he did was he said, you know, rather than a hypothetical imperative, you know, just a subjective point of state, that we must follow this categorical imperative. So it's categorical, it's an imperative that we must follow, and it's categorical that it applies to all. So how can we come up with something that's simply not based on this emotivism, but is something that we could rationally know and all follow in a rule? So this is deontological ethics again, all right? So anyway, Kant proposed a state that simply, when you say, I wish to tell the truth, like David Hume said, he said, well, that remains hypothetical. That's the hypothetical imperative. But if we're going to get to the categorical imperative, there's a few different versions of this, and your text lays that out. I'm just going to try to stick to one. Again, doing my best to keep it simple. And let me read it here. You should act according to the maxim, so this is a truth statement. You should act according to the maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it be a universal law. So unless you can will this for everybody, then you yourself should not follow it. But if you can will it for everybody and you should follow it, then this is not only just a categorical imperative, but it becomes binding on all people. And this overcomes what he felt, and a lot of people feel, is the subjectivism in Hume's non-cognitive emotivism, all right? Now, so if we say, for instance, that it's a categorical imperative that I should not lie, can I will that all people should not lie? Yes, because then we would live in a society of justice where people are not lying. The test for this categorical imperative differs from the emotive egoism, right? So with egoism, we're not just pursuing our self-interest, which you kind of see built in a little bit to Hume, right? I mean, there is a self-interest there, but it's based more on how we view the world as an is, and we're deriving our ought from that. And also, this is a little bit different than consequentialism. We're not just looking at what happens in the end. So we're saying, like, what is it that I should do in spite of how I feel about it, or in spite of how, let's say, it might play out to my advantage, okay? So we're not consequentialist. As a Kantian, Kant, you're not a consequentialist. So it's pretty much saying you should do the right thing no matter what. There's an issue with this, though. What happens when particular duties conflict? I mean, there's the classical example is if that you happen to be living in Poland and you're hiding a Jewish family in your house, and soldiers, German soldiers come and they bang on your door. Okay, so there's a duty here that you have to protect the innocent. So that's what has compelled you as a categorical imperative. I should protect the innocent because I think I could will that for all people. But what do I do when these people come to my door and they start banging on it and say, "Are you hiding any Jews?" Well, I also have a duty to tell the truth. That too is categorical imperative, because if I lie, then I have to will that this is good for all people, and I can't. So there are some issues with this. Now, just as a heads up, you could reframe this to how do you want to say satisfy that? In other words, is it really simply a lie that I'm doing, or is what I'm doing a sense of self-defense and protection of the innocent? I mean, is that an extension of that? But anyway, that's down the line. Okay, so that's pretty much just a little brief synopsis of Hume and Kant from the readings. So let's now talk about virtue. We're going to talk about virtue in the sense of, how well does a thing function? So a little bit different just to start out with, what we mean by virtue. So in other words, a knife can be virtuous. So a knife is designed to do what? So if we're saying like virtue has that aspect of doing that which it was designed to do, which is also a definition for freedom, by the way, then we're going to say, well, as long as it's ergonomic, right? It fits in my hand well. It cuts very well. We can conclude then that this knife is virtuous. So we're going to say the same thing about our particular lives. Like in Aristotle, when he talked about happiness, right? Eudaimonia, if you remember that term. And it's translated as happiness, but make certain that you're not thinking subjective contentment, like this is what makes you happy or makes me happy. This is really maybe a lot of the translators today are using the word blessedness. And I said that before, just keep in mind that it doesn't have the religious connotations. They're looking for a word that hasn't simply just been mutilated by our culture, because when somebody says, I just want to be happy, that can really mean a ton of things. We're looking here for like what fulfills the human person, like what would add to our sense of human flourishing, okay? So anyway, we have to ask ourselves, like, what about the company we keep? I mean, was there something to what our parents told us when we were younger that, we should only hang around those people that are good people, don't hang around bad people and such? Well, there's something to that, because if you want to make a good knife that cuts well and is ergonomic, you're going to pattern it after a knife that already does those things well. And if you want to be a virtuous person, you're going to try to pattern or associate yourself with people who are virtuous. We are very community and relationally oriented, so, we don't ever live in isolation. So there's something to who we hang around with matters. It's hard to understand and to accept when we're young, but as we get older, we find a little bit of wisdom in that, okay? And I'm not going to go back and spend time on the medial stat virtu, right? Virtue stands in the mean, because I've already talked to you, and it's in your text this week, but I've already talked to you about if we're going to be courageous, that's the deficiency would be cowardness. I'm running away from the battle, and the excess would be rashness. I'm charging relentlessly into a battle I have no hopes of ever attaining any goods from. So, it's always stands in the middle there, but I'll leave it in that. I want to talk to you real quickly about the cardinal virtues. I'm going to talk about justice most. Now, cardinal virtues, we hear the word cardinal when you can think of a bird or maybe like some guy wearing a big pointy hat. But the reality is it's the Latin word for hinge. So these are the hinge virtues. These are the virtues upon which all the other virtues, and there are many of them, in virtue theory, that they all kind of rely on. The first of those is known as prudence. And by the way, this is not cautious, like be cautious, be prudent. Prudence here in a philosophical sense in morality means applying right reason to an action. So it's doing what you should be doing by using your brain. So think and then act. And if you do both of those things well, then you're a prudent person. There's a famous line that says, if you want to know what the prudent thing is to do, then go ask a prudent person. That's good advice. It's like if you want wise and sage advice, then go and ask a wise and sage person. It's the same thing here. Okay, now justice. Justice is, and by the way, these are hierarchical. You notice I started out with prudence. And let me mention something. This is very important for you to know. Prudence is the mother of all virtues, okay? And by the mother, it's not that it simply gives birth, it's that it nurtures all the other ones. And without prudence, all the other ones are going to fail. So keep that in mind. I'll say something about that at the very end of this. So with justice, there's a lot of different definitions. I'll give you a very simple one. It's to give another their due, like what not what they're owed, maybe not even what is theirs. You might say, well, if I have something of somebody's, I need to return it. It's only so justice is to give the other person what is theirs, truly, that they own, not necessarily. Because if I were talking with you and I had some sort of weapon that was yours and you intended to hurt me with it, it certainly would not be justice for me to return that weapon to you. So it's what is due the other person. But we're going to talk too, like about what, and John Rawls comes in here, like what does it mean not just to act justly in a particular situation, but how do we create a just society? Okay. So anyway, um, he thought that we need to develop some sort of social contract. He proposes that, again, a little egoism, that since we do all act towards our own self-interest, but this self-interest is not simply like what I just simply want. It has to be constrained by our human wisdom. So it's a rational self-interest, like you almost think of Kant here, like what rational self-interest can we universally hold? I mean, all philosophers build on the ones that come before them. And, Rawls is, a mid 20th century philosopher. So to achieve this just society by our, bearing reason down in our own self-interest, we cannot fall into just an egotistical position, right? Because that would just be the majority in power. He develops the concept of what he calls an original position. And this is in your text. In other words, we have to put ourselves in a situation to make these determinations on a just society where we know the cards cannot be stacked in our favor. Kind of like there has to be a certain sort of blindness to there. And he works that out, right? He even says the way to develop this is through a veil of ignorance. So we have to try to make these determinations for a just society where we really don't have any of the factors. We don't have the knowledge of the personal, social, historical circumstances. Because if we don't have those elements, then we can't stack them in our favor. So we're going to form a principle, hopefully for justice, why we're in this imaginary state. It is an imaginary state. It's a blind way to, let's say, between our own self-interest and our own self-advantages, to put those aside so that we can, I don't want to say unbiased, but it is an unbiased way. That's just, it's more than just simply being unbiased. And this it's not ironic, but it may appear ironic. It could be that you even allow for inequalities. In other words, everybody getting something equal is not strict justice. Let's pretend we're dividing up a pie, and I mean like a physical pie. I don't mean like money divided up. If we're dividing up a physical pie and there's 8 people in the room and we can cut 8 slices of the pie, strict justice, if we don't understand it correctly, would say everybody gets 1 piece of pie, but not everybody may want pie. They may not like pie, or maybe they can't eat pie because they have some sort of medical situation. So it would not be just to give everybody a piece of pie, but only to those who can and do want that. All right. So you're going to see a little bit of a cost-benefit analysis going on in some like this. So it's similar to consequentialism, but it also allows a certain level of egoism, right? Self-interest. So you see that. Now here's a critique for this. If an unjust person, like a person doesn't practice justice themselves and they are not just themselves, can they really propose and could they really help us achieve and develop a just society? Now, that's an interesting critique because, Rawls would say, well, if we can just get just policies in place, then therefore that'll create a just society. But it does beg the question, like, would an absolutely corrupt politician be able to put together some sort of, mechanism or structure that's just for us all? I don't know. I think that's a very difficult thing. Another critique are, even if the rules are just, like if we get all the rules unjust, will that guarantee just results? Let's pretend even the people who are making these things are just themselves. Will this guarantee just results? Like, could the pursuit for justice create further injustices? So we're just shifting who's getting the injustice. Are we taking turns? Okay, now enter Karl Marx. Now, as for just rules in society, Karl Marx pretty much believed that there were simply there were structures of injustice that were simply embedded in society, and they could always be demonstrated between some sort of struggle. Typically in capitalism, and socialism, the way he promoted it was between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Okay, so the proletariat, they own all the means for the capital. So they own the factories and they own the equipment, and the proletariat are the working class. These guys, their equity is their labor. So they have no investment. So they wanted like a classless society where there would not be these type of divisions, right? So even though Rawls and Marx were both interested in what elements might create a just society, Marx, and everybody knows that the bourgeoisie never rose up. That was the idea, that there'd be some sort of revolt. The bourgeoisie would roll up because there's no way the proletariat, I misspoke. The proletariat rise up because there's no way the bourgeoisie would simply relinquish their power, okay? They're not going to give it up personally, so it's got to be taken from them some way. So in the historical case of socialism, and let's be clear, we're not talking about like the democratic socialism that's appearing in the United States and other countries, and capitalism, the proletariat never did really rise up. And it's not important for us right now why that didn't happen. People think there must have been something structured within Western culture that resisted it, or it could be like the religious affiliations that many people have that struck it. But nonetheless, some claim that it still remains as a remnant. Now, this probably leads a little more politically right, but we're trying to be even here and just say that it's not. The term cultural Marxism is a little bit of a misnomer, but their understanding is, the people that are proponents of that are saying that it isn't that there's still this undercurrent structure that wants to overthrow the capitalists, even though there are people that have issues with capitalism, which, we all should have issues on many things. Nothing's perfect. But that this struggle, the fact that there has to be some sort of struggle and conflict in order to achieve or resist through culture. So you find that this somehow has appeared, let's see, in between the haves and the have-nots. We hear a lot of discussion about that. A lot of focusing on racial disparities, a lot of focus on gender and sex dichotomies. And that's not saying there's not legitimate concerns there, but the cultural Marxists are saying that this is being forced to create division. In order to create division, then there could be some ability to overcome the culture and then put into place something that's a little more classless. All right, so you could take that for what it's worth, but they thought that's the only way to get through ideological and social change. Okay, so two quick, going a little longer here than normal, sorry. The last two virtues, one is fortitude. Now, fortitude, we could often hear this as courage, and it's a virtue that is the ability to endure a future difficult, but a future possible good. Now, that's all important because, one, if it's not difficult, right, like if I don't need courage if I'm able-bodied for me to reach down and tie my shoes. There's no sense for courage there. Or if I were to tell you, I'm going to jump off a 300-foot cliff and flap my wings, hoping to land softly and safely, I don't think you need fortitude for that either. So, it has to be just a difficult good, but it also has to be possible, and it has to be future-oriented. We don't really need courage for the past or even the present. I mean, we might need courage to go through what we're going through, but it's because we want to achieve, a future good outcome in that sense. All right. Now, why is fortitude important for us? Well, because, one of the enemies of fortitude is fear, and fear is paralyzing. And oftentimes these things are difficult to overcome. It could be fear of what's going to happen in your particular courses. It could be fear, will I finish school? How will I face my own mortality? Will I have a partner or spouse in life who will love me for any length of time, or only until things go bad? That thing. So fortitude is very important for a happy and virtuous life. The last one is temperance. Now, again, remember, this is hierarchical. We started out with prudence, we talked about justice, then we talked about fortitude, and now we're talking about temperance. This is the virtue that moderates our actions and our thoughts, right? Temperance is typically associated with the biological functions, sex and food, all right? So these are things that are good for us and things that we need. So temperance doesn't block something bad. It's just asking us to rightly order these things. So if we have, and by disorder, I'm not talking about a psychological or biological disorder. In philosophy, if our reason and our passions, like our appetites, that's our desires, if our reason and our appetites aren't in line, we call that disordered. So if a person doesn't use food for its proper end, there could be a disorder there. Now, I get there's eating disorders, but that's not what I'm talking about, although it is the same in this particular situation. But it could also be that way with sex. I mean, people can use sex in ways that do not bring, even if it brings pleasure, even if you're an egoist, it simply does not bring flourishing in your life. So all these things could be disordered, okay? Why is this the lowest of the cardinal virtues? That's interesting. Okay, since it governs what is necessary for us to have, right? We will not continue as a species if we don't procreate and eat. We're a little more tolerant of people who struggle with this, right? So we would think less of a person who's a coward, right? who struggles at some level there, as opposed simply to somebody who overeats. Okay, let's just say it that way. That's an easy one. So we would think less of a coward than somebody who struggles with overeating, because we know that overeating is just, the misorder or disorder or misusing of something that we absolutely need. And we'd also be much more upset with somebody who initiates unjust hiring processes, right, than a person who struggles and confuses sex and love. They don't understand that these things may have a relationship, but they're not the same, that type of thing. So in both those instances, we would say the person is acting imprudently, right, because they're not applying right reason to the action. So this is how the mother of all virtues come in. They're not achieving the good that is for themselves, right? So this is about who we are, not just getting an outcome, and not just about how we feel. So remember, prudence is the mother of all virtues. And if you're a Psycho fan like me, remember what Norman Bates said. You should always listen to your mother. All right. See you guys. Ciao.